This is part of Chaco Canyon. Everybody today, the experts all say that this was probably the capital of the Anasazi. And also, you know, what I found interesting was how some of our Indian guides and members of the tribes, they also refer to this as the Babylon of the Anasazi history. Very mysterious stuff was going on here, and part of that we might assume was happening inside these kivas. Now, we just learned that there were more than 40 of these very, very large kivas. These are some of the largest kivas I've ever seen. What is a kiva? The kivas were religious edifices. Some of the tribes would only allow the men to go in them, and it was in there that they did rituals, they did prayers, they put themselves into contact with other dimensional entities, the kachinas. Inside the kiva is a doorway called the sipapu. It's a mystical doorway that can be opened if the rituals are performed correctly. Dr. Don Mose told us that story of the portal opening in the Four Corners area. This reptilian being comes through. But key to this, he said this thing started teaching the natives when they went into their kivas to practice sorcery, to practice witchcraft, right? And that was when he said, through the sipapu, through the holy doorways that are in the kivas, maybe a mystical doorway opened. But suddenly, these very terrifying entities, these beings, including the giants, emerged onto the earth and began cannibalizing, destroying. In the petroglyphs, even right here in Chaco Canyon, are the giant six-toed footprints and six-fingered fingerprints. At a place called San Canyon Pueblo, not far from here, evidence of violence, of people being torn literally from limb to limb, children, women. None of this matches tribal warfare the way that we would have understood it. This was something entirely different that happened here. But in those kivas, they found strange artifacts. In each of the kivas, one finger from the hand, 3 teeth from the mouth. It was sorcery. It was black magic, we would call it, right? And it evidently did open a doorway.
So according to ancient Navajo tradition, the Anasazi people opened some kind of a portal and unleashed something dark and sinister on the earth, possibly in this very location.
I would not say that it's Navajo tradition. What I would say is that some of their medicine men would admit that that is actually what happened here.
During our expedition in the desert Southwest, we met with some of the elders of the Pueblo Indians to discuss their knowledge relating to the giants and stargates. Native Americans still keep the ancient traditions and legends of their ancestors. Much of America's true history is known only to the medicine men and the initiates of the tribal societies. Among the closely guarded secrets they keep from the outside world is information regarding the race of giants that once inhabited the Americas and the portals through which some of them were fabled to have emerged.
Our Pueblo Indian friends related many things to us off camera that they didn't want us to record. One of the most astonishing things that they told us pertained to the activation of what they called Stargates.
We were told that the highest ranking medicine men from each tribe gathered together every year in a specific location in the desert to open a dimensional portal, a Stargate. And this isn't some kind of vision quest or peyote hallucination. According to them, their medicine men know how to open the gates.
They describe the gate to us in technological terms. In other words, it has physical composition. It's not merely a metaphysical abstraction. They talked about a screen-like apparatus that, when activated, has the appearance of flowing water. And they claim that their medicine men are able to communicate with entities on the other side of the gate, and even receive foreknowledge of important events in advance.
They told us of the moment in which they had received the vision of 911 days before it had happened, and they were all so very troubled by the fact that they saw these planes moving through the air, crashing into these tall buildings, and they even knew it was going to be in New York City, but it was how it happened. When they and the medicine men went to a very specific area, and they came very close to telling us where this one specific area is at, where there is a Stargate, an active gateway, an active portal, a doorway of some kind.
After witnessing the events of 9/11 in advance, the medicine men went around briefing the tribes on what they had seen in the Stargate and warning their people to stay away from New York City. As unbelievable as it sounds, all of the Pueblo Indians we spoke with confirmed this story.
But the other part of that vision, that gateway, that doorway that opened in which they saw into the future, was that they knew at that moment that this had something to do in their worldview with us entering into the final world phase. Their worldview, this was a moment in which they understood that now we're entering into the fourth world, a time in which the giants are going to be reanimated, that are going to return to the earth in a time of great tribulation. I was shocked that they were willing to share that information with us.
My name is Clifford Mahudi. I am a Zuni Pueblo elder. There were giants according to our Zuni history and legends, and of course it became mythology. And there was a lot of references to that in other systems, such as the medicine societies, in all the rituals that we used to go through. And there has been many stories about it. First of all, is one of the ones that I remember very well is that they actually used to live underground. And this is where they supposedly live, is in the what we call the underworld. It's not what we consider the fourth world, but it's the underworld system that they come out of at certain times. So the giant people were around here, and also that they would migrate to other Pueblo people in their domains at that time. And one of the things that I learned when I used to go up to the Paiute Nation was they actually had some red-headed giants that are buried up there. I have a friend that is like a mountain climber type person. He goes out there and collects a lot of ancient stuff out there in the desert. And he talks about the burial places of the red-headed giants. And he doesn't talk up to anybody because he knows that if they found out, they're going to take those bones. And in the past, usually the museums took them and they disappeared.
The greatest cover-up in history is the cover-up of history. And in the United States, no other organization has covered up more history than the Smithsonian Institution. Based in Washington, D.C. and funded primarily by the federal government, the Smithsonian Institution has exhumed, confiscated, and sequestered thousands of out-of-place artifacts in America since the year of its founding in 1846. Originally established by its founder, James Smithson, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, the institution was quickly hijacked in its early years by Darwinist doctrinaires, who turned it into a propaganda machine for the theories of evolution and isolationism. Isolationism is an anthropological doctrine which asserts that ancient American societies were isolated from the outside world and delegitimizes the notion that foreign cultures had contact or influence in pre-Columbia America. One of the greatest proponents of isolationism was a man by the name of John Wesley Powell, who became director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1800s. Under Powell's direction, any artifacts discovered in America that contradicted the theories of evolution and isolationism were either destroyed or concealed in the vaults of the institution.
Powell had a proclivity of trying to obfuscate any language that directly referred to giants. The discovery of giants in early American history, redundantly by different universities, left the Smithsonian in a position of needing to control the flow of information. And they obviously wouldn't have liked that the discovery of giant bones supported the biblical narrative and not the Darwinian narrative.
Lake Powell and the rivers that fed it were named after John Wesley Powell. Now, John Wesley Powell is the guy that ran the Smithsonian, and he had a problem. He couldn't accept the fact that people prior to his discovery were incredibly advanced seafarers. So when John Wesley Powell took over the Smithsonian and started heading it up, there was a real attempt to hide anything that was an out-of-place artifact, which is called an OOPArt, O-O-P-A-R-T.
At the turn of the 19th century, the agents of the Smithsonian Institution were confronted with a vexing dilemma. On the one hand, the institution's official dogma was Darwinism and isolationism. But on the other hand, out-of-place artifacts and the bodies of giants, in some cases with red hair and arrayed in ornate copper armor, were turning up all over the United States, especially in the mounds.
Americans today know almost nothing about the mystery of the mound builders, but in early America was a hot topic of the day. At one time, the landscape of the eastern United States was dotted with thousands of artificial mounds. What made the mounds so fascinating in the minds of the early Americans was what could be found buried inside of them. They were filled with strange artifacts and bones, including the bones of the giants.
That giants were buried in the mounds of America was an undisputed reality in the 1800s. Even Abraham Lincoln, while waxing poetically about Niagara Falls in some lecture notes, assumes the fact to be commonly known.
From the late 1800s through the early 1900s, universities across the United States and our own independent Indiana Jones types were taking to the mounds and doing excavations, and quite often giant bones were being discovered and unearthed. And there are literally dozens and dozens of newspaper articles from reputable sources from the late 1800s through the 1900s discussing the discovery of giants 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall. One of them that I read, 12 feet tall.
So prevailing was the question of the mound builders in the late 19th century that in 1881, Congress commissioned the Smithsonian Institution to conduct a widespread archaeological investigation of the mounds, which essentially granted the institution exclusive control over all mound excavations and subsequently the artifacts buried within them.
And so they took control of the excavations away from many of the independent universities and sent in their own teams. They even called it the mound excavation teams, specifically targeting the American Indian mounds where many of the bones of the giants were being discovered.
The excavation teams tore through the mounds with great haste. In just 9 years, 2,000 of them were unearthed and tens of thousands of artifacts were carted off to the Smithsonian's repositories. They destroyed as much as they discovered in their rush to preempt any more civilian excavations and to confiscate the artifacts and bones that flew in the face of the institution's sanctioned narrative of American history.
Ultimately, in accordance with Powell's doctrine, and despite many of the artifacts testifying to the contrary, the mound builders were officially declared to be ordinary indigenous peoples of the Americas. No further explanation was furnished by the Smithsonian Institution as to why six-fingered giants with red hair arrayed in copper armor, among other oddities, were sometimes discovered in the mounds. The case was closed. Powell's doctrine prevailed, even as the vaults of the Smithsonian were packed with artifacts that categorically debunked his worldview.
And many of the findings of the Smithsonian, which included people of extraordinary height and size, are still documentable to this day, even from the Smithsonian's own reports. For instance, The following is a brief list of documented findings, all recorded in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution in 1875. Item 1, one skull measuring 36 inches in circumference. Item 2, one full skeleton with double rows of teeth buried alongside a gigantic axe, referred to in the report as a gigantic savage. Another part of that same report, giant axes and skinning stones, one weighing over 15 pounds, that had an ornately carved handle and was of such mass that it documented only a giant could have wielded this. Another jawbone that easily slipped completely around the entire face of a large man during the Smithsonian recording. And then there's the 5th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian, where they document 10 more skeletons buried in a mass grave, giant skeletons. And then in the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in 1894, where it documents 2 enormous skulls, several baffling femur bones, and 17 full giant skeletons that were recorded. Now, these are all documents that are still available. And so if one were to say, well, you're only reciting the conspiracy theory about the cover-up of giant bones that were excavated under the Smithsonian, no, these are actually in their own reports. So we do know that even though the Powell doctrine was in place and there was an intentional effort to obfuscate the language around the recovery of giants, that indeed this was happening in early American history, and it is part of the record.
The mounds were not the only problem for the institution. All over America, from coast to coast, well into the 20th century.